Hey, it's Warren Coughlin here. Welcome to another episode of the Business That Matters Spotlight, a podcast dedicated to spotlighting entrepreneurs who combine business discipline and desire to make the world a better place through entrepreneurship. And today should be a pretty fascinating conversation. If you're an entrepreneur, you probably have kind of a love-hate relationship with systems and processes, right? Most entrepreneurs prefer the freedom and decision-making that responds to the issue at hand and being able to innovate on the fly. But at the same time, you probably know that some structure and having clear ways of doing things will make your team more productive, your life maybe a little bit less chaotic. Well, today's guest is all about this. Now, before you go and say, oh my God, this is going to be dry stuff, Yvonne is going to share some really powerful stories about how this work can actually change and frankly, even save lives. So I think you may be inspired to say, SOP, that's for me. SOP means standard operating procedure, and Yvonne Weld is the master of the SOP. Her business is the Weld Group, and she's here to help you get control. Yvonne, welcome to the Spotlight.
Thanks, Warren. It's great to be here. I love what you just said, SOP, that's for me. I might even steal that tagline for future.
You can use it in your marketing, just credit me.
Exactly.
So as always, what we like to do here is like to reward people who tune in with some useful pearl of wisdom right out of the gate so that if they can't make it through the whole podcast, they'll always know they get some value by listening in. So if you could give one tip to an entrepreneur who thinks getting systems in place is, unnecessary, too hard, what would that be?
So one of the best tips I ever give people is the value of a phone. So we all carry these lovely phones in our pockets all the time, and we always have them with us. So for someone who says, I don't have the time to create systems and processes, your phone is your best tool. So you'll often find me when I'm driving from place to place, I've got the record button going on my phone and the audio setting, and I'm talking through a process. So I just think of one of the challenges I had the day before and how could a process have helped me through that challenge. And when you're at your computer, the next time you're doing a task is turn on the record. So whether you're a Google Meet person or you're a Zoom person or a Teams person, just turn on Teams or any other platform. I know Mac has them built right into the Mac platform, but turn on a platform where you can share your screen and talk through the process. I mean, you've got to do the task anyways, so you might as well be recording what you're doing at that time. So talk through it. Let's say you're doing a blog post. I go to my website. This is where the website is. I put it in my username and password. Then I go over here and you're showing it as you're doing it and you talk it through. And then you can just name that recording, whatever the process is that you were doing. And later on, you can get it transcribed. Someone can take screenshots to create an actual document if you want. But at the very least, now it's easy to delegate that blog post because you can just send them the recording. So remember that recording is a great first step. So whether you use your phone or your screen recording, whatever it might be, that's a great first step.
Nice tip. That makes it nice and easy. Yes. All right. So I've not hinted, I've been pretty direct about what your business is, but can you tell us just a bit about the Weld Group? What you do, who you do it for, how long you've been around?
Absolutely. So the Weld Group focuses on creating standard operating procedures for companies. So a lot of times people are like, I don't know where to start. I don't even know what I need to document. And so we go in and we make working with us as easy as having a conversation. I have this knack of being able to interview someone and ask the right questions. And I just keep asking questions until I understand your process. And then I take those recordings back to my team, and my team creates you standard operating procedure manuals. So those manuals would include visuals for those visual people, because we've all heard people learn in different ways. So there's visuals, so it would be like a flow chart of how to do things. Then we have documented step-by-step processes, and we also provide you with the recordings with a list of this is what on the recording from this minute to this minute we talked about this process, and from this minute to this minute we talked about this process, so that if someone wanted to, they could take that recording and pull excerpts from it and create their own library of processes, if you will. And so the typical people that we work with are larger companies because it is a labor intensive process. So it can be quite costly. But the other thing we do is we have workshops and we have consulting services for the smaller entrepreneur who wants to attempt to do it on their own. And we help them walk them through the process. And we also have do-it-yourself manuals that we have available on our website as well.
And you have a free video series too on your website, don't you?
Absolutely. And, Warren, I am just a big believer in the more people who can have these systems and processes, the better. So I don't even ask for an email. Like, you can go to my website and access our free video series, and it's 5 videos that walk you through some of the processes. These are the exact things that preamble, I guess you could say, my workshop. In my workshop, I actually walk you through the process. Like, I take an actual process and walk someone through the exact process I would use with a client. But the video series is going to be a great starting point for anybody who's thinking about systems and processes. And they're all there available for you to get you started in the right direction, I guess you could say.
Nice. I want to circle back, I hope, on the sort of visual versus experiential and that kind of thing. I think that's really interesting. Actually, well, let me just ask it now. I'm intrigued by it. In your experience, what is most popular? Like, there's a lot of consultant types like me, who, although I don't do this, but, who'll go in and say, you got to do the manual. People produce this big standard operating procedure manual, and then nobody ever reads it.
Nobody reads it. Yes.
So, like, I know there's different styles, but on average, what's the preferred modality by which people are most effective at learning processes?
Well, the best ones are those visuals. So when you can have a process map that you can follow, where it's like, okay, the main step is written there, and then they can go to the manual for the exact step by steps. It almost becomes like a checklist, Warren, where it's like, okay, I did this. Now I move on to this step. Yes, I did that. Now move on to this step. Oh, wait a minute. How do I do that one again? And then you can go to the manual and actually see the step-by-step of how to do that manual. Yep. But after a while, once you've gone through the process a few times, the map is a really great, okay, yep, I need to remember what the exact steps are, especially when you haven't done something or you have a task that's like, say, an annual task. Where it's like, I only do it once a year. It's like, oh yeah, what were those steps again?
Right. I think that's important for entrepreneurs to hear, because sometimes, as I say, they'll have heard from somebody that to do a standard operating procedure manual, and it's just so against the grain for themselves because they're not big readers of manuals themselves. They're, want quick information, and their teams are the same. And so they spend effort, and then it doesn't accomplish the objective. Whereas reducing it to some visual representation makes it much easier to apply.
Exactly. And one thing that I want to note here, Warren, because if I don't say it now, well, it's in my head, I'll forget, and then I won't say it, is processes are only as good as the people who use them. So I'm not a cookie cutter type person. Like, I'm not going to create a big wordy manual if no one in your team is going to follow the wordy manual. If someone said to me, you know what, we're all virtual, so create us videos for everything. Like, I'm fine to create videos for everything if that's going to work for your team, because, I can dictate what a process might look like, and here's what I think you should do. But if no one in your team follows it, then there's no sense in having it.
Right. Now, let's be candid. You're a bit of a freak of nature, right? Anybody listening is getting that? Like, you don't just work on processes; you love them.
I do.
It's not exactly the norm in the entrepreneurial world. So where did that come from for you?
So I guess I've always been a process person, but it all comes back to my early days in corporate. So I worked in a law firm. And when I was in the law firm, I worked in real estate law. And every transaction, although the same, was different. So there was different wording that had to be used and different situations that you had. If A, then B happens, and if B, then C happens. And so I just started writing it all out, and I ended up with this really thick binder, and the people in my office used to lovingly refer to it as the Bible. And everybody would come to my desk and can I look in your Bible for a minute? So it was like I had already done the work for everybody in our office. And so I guess you could say it worked for me there. And because it worked for me there, because as a legal clerk, it's like the situation was always changing. And back to that, sometimes you only do things once a year. It was the same thing. I didn't want to have to keep thinking through the process. Having it written down made it so much easier for me.
Yeah, that's key. Now, you from the law firm, you shared with me previously, if you're comfortable sharing it, a little bit about your dad's story and how impactful that was about the importance of having processes.
Yeah, I would love to share that because I think there's a lot of really great lessons in it for entrepreneurs out there. So my dad started a construction business. He worked in the heavy construction and he loved running machines and all of that kind of stuff. He was Mr. Everything was in his head. He would work from sun up to sundown out in the field, managing his team and working with clients and things like that. And then he would come home at night and he'd have all his paper there. He knew what all the papers meant. He knew how, what clients he was talking to. Nothing was really written down. It was all in his head. And
there's no entrepreneur who understands that at all.
No one, exactly. And so what ended up happening was one weekend, because of all the stress, because of the endless hours he was working, he had a heart attack. So now I'm going to preface this by saying he's fine, but it was touch and go there for a little while. And more importantly, because this happened on a Saturday and on Sunday, my mom and I and my brothers were at the hospital and my dad's foreman called and said, okay, I know where I'm going tomorrow, but where are we going past that? And what are we doing past that? And so I ended up taking a leave of absence from my corporate job and jumped in because my dad had to have open heart surgery. So we knew it was going to be a long recovery. And I knew that his foreman in the field was not a paper person. Like he was not going to figure the systems and the processes out. So I went in and my dad was funny. The system that I figured out, Warren, was when something comes in, it goes in this slot. He had like one of those organizers on his desk. So it was like, it goes in this slot. And when I've looked at it, I move it to this slot. And once I've dealt with it, I move it to this slot. And when it needs filing, it goes in the filing pile. And so this was his way of dealing with things. So I ended up going in and systematizing everything. I set up processes and everything so that it was very clear. I ended up actually leaving my corporate job and became the office manager there so that my dad wouldn't have as much stress. And so he could just do what he loved, because we all know the reality of it was he would rather be out in the field from sunup to sundown. He didn't really enjoy the coming back to the office at night. And there's so many entrepreneurs that are like that. They don't enjoy that aspect of it. So when he decided to retire, then we were able to use those processes, and the new owner's daughter was able to come in and run the company easily because everything was processed, systematized, documented. And it just made the transfer so much easier.
Essentially, that's one of the things I talk to entrepreneurs a lot about is, people always say, well, in my industry, this kind of business has this kind of multiple, and that's what the value of the business is. And I always go, hold the phone. Like that's a generic kind of thing. But imagine you're a purchaser and there's two businesses that you can buy. One of them, you're going to have to go in and figure everything out. Interview everybody. You're going to have to manage things on a daily basis to make sure everything's done right. The other business has got all the SOPs. Everyone knows what they're supposed to do. You can walk in, pick up some manuals, know how things are going to get done. Which of those two businesses do you think is worth more money?
Exactly.
As soon as you hear that, you go, oh, right. So it isn't just, making life easier. It actually increases the value of the business, because that way you just described that the new owner's daughter could just come in and run it. How valuable is that to the purchaser?
Exactly. Exactly. And I've seen it again and again. I worked with a company last year that this was the exact scenario. He knew that he wanted to retire. And so I came in and I helped him to create those processes. And Warren, I don't think I shared this story with you earlier, but while I was doing the processes for him, his daughter suddenly passed away of a drug overdose. And
Oh
it
my God.
allowed me, because he was a solo entrepreneur, because we had created the manuals, I went in and I ran his business for the week that he needed off in order to deal with what he was dealing with. And I knew nothing about, so it was a printing industry. I knew nothing about printing before I went in and started creating the processes. But imagine being able to do something like that. Like, how many entrepreneurs are there out there that are solo, that if something happened in their life, they'd have to shut the doors? Like, imagine having something where you no longer have to shut the doors. You could have anyone step in and at least keep your business on hold for a week, know how you want to questions answered and things like that. So, they're invaluable for continuity in your business.
Yeah. That's a great story. Now, you had another one. I was, your husband's story. You had a virtual assistant business of your own. You just
Right.
shared that whole, because there's two parts to that that are so interesting. One is that how your business was able to continue, and how it helped your husband.
Exactly. So when I left working for my father, once he sold the business, I started my own business as a virtual assistant. And so a big part of what I was doing was helping people to create processes, thus how the transition to my consulting business started. But the bigger story here, Warren, that I know that you're referring to is when I started my own virtual assistant business, I documented everything. Here's the client. Here's the things that I do for the client.
You weren't a
Here's
plumber,
how
you
to-
were keeping pipe.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, here's how to do each one of those things. And at the same time that I had my virtual assistant business, my husband and I owned a business as well. It was a franchise, and it wasn't doing nearly as well as we had hoped it would do. It was a very stressful situation because we had put all of our money into, or we had saved for a while. We thought it was going to be a successful franchise opportunity. We put our money into the franchise, and it didn't go as well. And the stress and the anxiety from all of that played on my husband's mental health. And he had a suicide attempt. Now, again, I'll preempt this with, he is still alive today, but at the time, you don't tell a franchisor, we're not opening tomorrow. So while my husband was in hospital recovering and getting help with his mental health, it was several months that I had to go and run that store. And I couldn't do both. I couldn't run the store and run my virtual assistant business. And luckily, I was able to send a message to another virtual assistant. And the only thing I needed to share, Warren, was one password. And it was, here's my access to everything. It was actually in my Google Drive at the time. And I was like, my email address, here's the password to my Google Drive. Everything's in there. And I just was able to turn my business over to her because of all the processes there. She was able to send a message to all my clients because she had the client list and let them know what was going on and that she would be taking care of them in the interim. Warren, I didn't share this with you, but she even sold an additional client while I was gone because I had my sales process in there. Well, and so when I came back, I actually had a bigger business than when I had left. And so it was nice that I could concentrate on, closing up that franchise and winding things up without the stress of, oh my God, now I got to run two businesses at once. And so it wasn't too much after that I was like, you know what, this is powerful stuff. There's more people that need to be doing this. And thus I evolved from my virtual assistant business and started the Weld Group and consulting in 2017. And, it's work that not everybody realizes the importance of until something happens. So It's not until something happens that you go, oh, Now's when I need the systems and processes and do that nature. We're often called in when those situations happen. And then it's like, okay, now we're rushing to attempt to get information out of someone's head.
Better to do it ahead of time. And even just, I often think of these things in terms of like just how you look after your family afterwards as well. Like I think you told me one story about somebody actually did pass away, but it helped the succession for the spouse. Like imagine, your income is dependent on one of the spouse's businesses. That spouse passes away, and how does the business run? How does that spouse come in and either run the business or sell the business, or does it just crash and then they have no income?
Right. And so what had happened there, Warren, is a gentleman came to me and he wanted me to help him to create a succession plan, if you will. So it was a list of what would happen in the event something happened to him. So he had made arrangements with a friend that the friend would come in and close up the business, but we documented some of what his friend needed to do as well. And so it was just a list for his wife. Step 1, call this person. Step 2, call this person, because where it came from was his best friend owned a business and one night laid on the couch and never woke up again. And his wife was like, I don't know where to go or what to do. And, there was outstanding contracts and she didn't have a clue what those outstanding contracts were because she was solo and her husband had taken deposits. Many people take deposits. And now it was a big mess trying to figure out who she needed to return things to. And no one even knew how to get into his emails because no one knew his email password. And so it was just a huge mess. And he didn't want that for his wife. So that was where that one came from. Again, back to you don't realize you need it until something happens to trigger you needing it.
So one of the, I just last week was talking to a client about this. We're working through some systems, and one of the tensions, and I'd love your take on this to the extent there is an answer to it, is there's always this tension between detail and pragmatism. Right. And like, I often have these discussions with people about, oh my God, do I have to say like, turn left, reach with your right hand and pull the glass out of the cover? Like how do you make that determination as to, because some of those things actually have a quality impact, right? Like doing something on one side of a table versus the other side of the table can add 5 minutes to a production process, which impacts productivity. And so how do you balance that? Oh my God, this thing is completely overwhelming. There's 973 steps to do one thing versus being too generic that it's not actionable.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, Warren, and something that I'm faced with a lot of times. So there's no short answer to this, but let me give you a few things that will help someone to understand. So the things that are, what's the word I'm looking for? Like common sense, I guess you could say, don't need to be documented. But the things that are important to you should be documented with an explanation. So let me give you an example. I was working with a service-based like home services company, and they wanted people to park on the street versus parking in the driveway. But they were finding that people weren't following the process. They were parking in the driveway all the time, even though they wanted them to park on the street. And so what we ended up doing was documenting, you're going to park on the street, and this is the reason you're going to park on the street. So I didn't have to say, park on the street, park this way, like it was common sense how you would park on a street, if you will. But it was the reasoning behind it. So much like you said, sometimes you do it on the left side of the desk and sometimes on the right. There might be a reason why you do the left over the right side. It's the same thing for parking on the street. In this case, it was the reasoning the company had was you never know when someone in the driveway may need to come in or go out. Now you've blocked their driveway. And not only that, but we're construction trucks and we would hate to have a leak that would go all over someone's driveway. We would rather you have a leak on the road and we can deal with that, right? So once everybody understood the meaning behind why they wanted them to park on the street, then they didn't have any issues anymore. So sometimes it's more about an explanation might be needed. But yes, I agree with you. It shouldn't say park on the street. Make sure you park with the nose facing this direction or anything like that. Like
Right.
people understand what park on the street means.
Yeah, but that's a great point about, because the idea of giving explanations for things gives respect to your team, and it also makes it feel less autocratic or dictatorial from an owner that you have to do things this way. When people understand there's a reason for it, then they can feel invested in it.
Exactly. And something that just came to my head too, Warren, is in the case of this company that I worked with that I was just discussing, they said the training of their new team members goes so much more smoothly now that they have the SOP manual, because before what used to happen was they would take a new team member to the house and they would park on the street, but they wouldn't think to explain to the person, here's why I'm parking on the street. So then the person would be left on their own and they wouldn't understand the importance of parking on the street. Whereas when the manual was completed, now instead of taking the person on the street the first week, they actually sat them down in their office and went through the manual. And they talked through the manual. And so they would use the flow chart, because the person training knew what the flow chart, what each thing in the flow chart meant. And they would talk more to what that step meant. So when it said park on the street, they would say, here's why we park on the street, and give them more explanations. And they said, having the manuals now to train to is so much more efficient than just taking someone out, because you don't miss anything. You know exactly what you need to say in a training. It just makes it so simple.
Right. And getting people productive faster is so important. So
exactly.
One of the questions also is just I know you've got the whole training on how to do it, but if one is getting started with this, when you start a process, how do you begin? Like, do you start, I've done it a few different ways myself, but I love your take on it. Like, some people start at the end, like, what's the objective of this? And what's the last step before the thing is completed? And what's the step, and actually work backwards. Whereas some people start, no, what's the first thing you do? Is there a preferred, just as if people are listening to this going, geez, I should really start this, and maybe I can't engage Yvonne because I'm small. What would be just the starting point? Is it the end point, the middle point, somewhere between, or the start?
So I start with the biggest aspects of it. So for example, let's use the example of this service-based company that I was talking about before. And so it's like, what are the different phases in a service delivery? So let's say a service company was coming out to do maintenance on your furnace. Okay, so what are the steps? Well, the first step is arrival at the home. So what happens when you arrive at the home? The second step would be, okay, now that you've arrived at the home, what is the communication that needs to happen with the homeowner before you even get started? That's the second phase. And then the third phase is the actual maintenance. So what does that look like? And then the fourth phase would be the follow-up communication with the client. So you know that there's 4 basic steps. Okay, so now in the first step, then you start breaking it down. So start with what are the main steps, and then break it down even further. When I'm explaining to people who are on their own, Warren, I like to use the example of a recipe. So imagine you open up your cookbook, okay? You've got different aspects of a recipe that you want it to look like, right? So the first thing is, typically there's a picture. This is the outcome. This is like, at the end, if my picture doesn't look like the picture in the cookbook, I know I didn't follow the process properly.
Oh
So
man, mine never do.
exactly. That is correct. They never quite look exactly the same. But what you would do is you'd be like, what's the outcome? So what is the purpose of this process? So what are we expecting to have happen? And then you have your ingredients, if you will. So what are all the different things, the ingredients and the equipment, if you will. So that would be the second thing, is what are all the things I need in place in order to make this process happen? So is it people? Is there resources? Is there somewhere on the computer I need to go? Like, how do I know that I'm in the right place? And then it's the step by step by step. So if you think about it, always the first step is preheat the oven. But most people, they just get started in doing the recipe, like putting together the ingredients, and then they go, oh, what was the oven supposed to be at? There's a reason you preheat the oven first, is so that once you have everything together, you put it in the oven. So,
Right.
the more often that you cook, the more often you start to trigger, oh yeah, I should have done that step first. And so if you think recipe and what would be all the resources that I need, like what's my ingredient list, and then what are the steps that I need to take.
Awesome. That's great advice. So what about you? What about the Weld Group? What's next?
What's next for the Weld Group? Well, we are focusing more and more on companies that have considered or want to consider franchising their company. So often they get to a point where, okay, I want to take this in multiple locations, whether it's through franchising or just opening another location and hiring an internal manager. But imagine this, Warren, you have this really great cafe and you have your special way of doing it. And, you put a little bit of extra salt in the coffee grounds so that it takes the bitterness away. And you have a particular way that you froth the cream in order to put it on top of that latte. And now you open a second location, and because you don't have systems and processes written down, your manager says, oh, I'm going to take some shortcuts. It's faster if I don't put the salt in, and if I froth it and I don't take that extra care. And what ends up happening is people go to your first location and have an experience there, and then they go to your second location and they don't have the same experience. It reflects on your first location, whether you understand that or not. So if you want consistency and you want your customers to have a similar experience from location to location to location, systems and processes are the way to do that. And these are the people who get it, who understand the importance. So although we will work with companies that are just growing immensely, our sweet spot is those people who now want to go from location to location, and they're running into these problems of people not having consistent experience from one location to another. So that's one
big franchise when people are starting, is they don't actually understand how difficult it is to get. They think that if somebody just buys a franchise and puts in, $100,000 or $80,000 or whatever into the franchise, that they're just going to follow things along. But if you don't have those things well documented, I've seen different franchises where it's just failed for that reason.
Exactly. And like I said, if you don't document your process and tell someone why the process is like that. So back to our example, if I don't tell someone why I put salt in, then someone's going to think, oh, it's just faster if I don't do that. It's not documented anywhere I do it. So who cares, right? So that is the whole purpose of systems and processes, is to make that consistency. Then you can train to the manual, you can praise to the manual, you can discipline to the manual, and all those other things to ensure that consistency happens.
Nice. All right. I always finish off with just some rapid fire questions for the owner. Sounds like good. You. So one decision or action that most helps you get where you are.
Back to processes. It's like the day that I decided that, okay, I need to document my business is what got me to where I am today.
You are nothing if not consistent.
Yes, exactly.
If you had to do it over again, would you change anything, or what would it be to make it easier, faster?
I think from the very beginning, I would have built a team. So, I was another one of those entrepreneurs who convinced myself no one's going to do it as good or anything as me, and having the processes to train on. But what was really important for me to understand is sometimes my team comes in and they enhance those processes. So they have a better idea, a newer way to do it. So as soon as I let go of no one's going to do it as good as me and stop looking for a clone of myself, if you will, that's when my business really started to take off, because there are people out there that can do things as good as, if not better, than you can.
One aspect of running a business you've yet to master.
Time management.
Oh, that's
It's
funny.
like I could go down a rabbit hole some days where it's like, I could make plans for my plans because I get excited about something. It's like that shiny object syndrome. Oh my God, I got a new idea, a better idea. So it's like, if I would just focus on one thing, it would be better to managing my time.
And to the extent it's a different answer, what's one personal quality? So not necessarily a skill, but what's one personal quality you most had to improve or overcome to succeed?
Persistence, definitely persistence. It's like understanding that you need to see something through to completion before you get onto something else, because otherwise you end up with 27 3/4 the way finished projects.
I sing that song to entrepreneurs all the time. Get some focus going. And one, no false humility, one personal quality that most contributed to your success.
Belief in what I was doing. So just that compassion for entrepreneurs and not wanting to see entrepreneurs go through the same thing my dad went through. That was the one thing that's really kept me going.
Nice. So how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you can visit me on the web. It's the weldgroup.ca, and all of our contact information is on there, or, look for us on LinkedIn or Facebook under the Weld Group.
Thank you so much. You've dropped some big pearls of wisdom, and I really hope people paid attention to it because it'll really help them get control of their businesses and their lives. So thanks for being on the spotlight.
Thanks for having me, Warren.